In January 2024, a large crowd gathered outside a restaurant in the South Korean city of Bupyeong. In fact, everyone was surprised and concerned because the restaurant they were standing in front of was usually open every single day of the year. People had never seen this hotel closed before, but when it did shut down, a crowd of regular customers gathered outside, wondering what had happened and why it was closed. And when it finally reopened, the world witnessed a situation that you too would likely find hard to believe. And for me personally, it was absolutely harrowing. In fact, the case was so significant that it was even featured on a TV show. But after seeing and learning about it, you too will lose faith in the concept of kinship. To understand this extremely brutal case, we need to go to the city of Bupyeong in Incheon, South Korea. It was here that a restaurant was located, owned by a 30-year-old woman named E. In reality, Lee had worked very hard to bring the restaurant to this point. It was, after all, a family business. His parents had also run the restaurant, but back then, there wasn't any significant technology available. So, they somehow managed to keep things moving, but by the time Lee stepped into the business, it was already doing exceptionally well. New customers visited the restaurant every day, and Lee had made it a point to let everyone know that the restaurant would remain open 365 days a year. It would never close, not even on holidays. And achieving that required immense hard work. Lee toiled tirelessly. He dedicated the prime of his youth to running this restaurant. He stepped into the business and took charge of it back when he was still of an age to be studying. He took the venture forward and brought his younger brother on board to assist him. Although his brother was still studying, he would occasionally come to the restaurant to help out. Lee also hired 2 more staff members, and with a lot of hard work, he expanded his restaurant. Now, the name Lee I'm telling you about isn't real, because when this case was published in South Korea, when it came to public attention, to maintain privacy, the names of the victim and the culprits were not disclosed or made public. So I have assigned the name Lee to her. Lee was working up to 18 hours a day at the hotel, trying her best to move the business forward. In fact, she personally sourced recipes from outside. He started preparing intercontinental dishes at his restaurant, and they were a huge hit with everyone. In fact, people would line up outside even before the restaurant opened in the morning, because everyone loved his grilled dishes so much. The crowd here showed no signs of thinning out. However, time gradually passed, and January 2024 arrived. Then, one morning, people gathered outside the hotel, intending to get their orders packed to take away. But even after waiting for a long time, the hotel simply did not open. People began to speculate. Perhaps Lee had fallen ill, or a staff member had gone on leave, which was why the hotel hadn't opened, so everyone eventually left. The next day, a crowd gathered there again, but once more, there was no one present. There was no staff, no Lee, and no one else who managed the hotel. Absolutely no one. The hotel remained closed like this for 2 weeks, but the hotel suddenly opened in early February 2024, and everyone was amazed. As soon as they started coming in, everything was absolutely perfect. People began asking Lee, "Hey Lee, why did you keep the hotel closed for so long? We were so used to your food, we couldn't go even a single day without it. We used to gather outside every day, but the hotel just wouldn't open." Lee explained that he had been facing some unavoidable family issues, which is why he had to keep the hotel closed for a while. By now, everyone had settled at their respective tables. Some were planning to get their food packed to go. However, they noticed something different here. Previously, before the hotel had shut down, 4 people used to work here: Lee, his younger brother, and 2 staff members. But now that the hotel had reopened, there was a new manager. Because she was sitting right there, watching everything, a 79-year-old woman, observing all the customers. In fact, she wasn't just watching, the billing counter was also right there with her. And whenever an order came to Lee, she would direct the customers to go to her to settle the bill. In reality, the 79-year-old woman was none other than Lee's maternal aunt, specifically his mother's older sister, who had arrived to take charge of the hotel as its manager. When people began interacting with her, they found the situation quite odd, as the elderly woman was behaving in a rather peculiar manner, because the moment she processes a bill, she grabs the customer's hand, looks them in the eye, and starts predicting their future, telling them things like, "This has happened to you," or "This might happen to you," or "Your life is in danger," basically engaging in those typical occultist antics. Eventually, customers discussed this with Lee, saying, "That new manager of yours, your aunt, she's a bit odd. She's been acting rather strangely." We didn't particularly care for her behavior. That's when Lee explained that she was his aunt, Shim, and Shim is just an imaginary name. It's not her real name. So, Lee told us her name was Shim and that she was a shaman. Actually, shaman is a Korean term that we could equate to a tantric. You know, the kind who wander around with a satchel. They deal with things like resolving domestic strife, fixing marital discord, getting rid of a rival woman, or unearthing buried treasure. The sort of tantric who knocks back liquor with a pinch of salt. That's the type of figure Shim was. She was a female shaman who, having previously been Lee's aunt, which she genuinely was now sitting there, acting as his manager. And what struck everyone as quite peculiar is how shamans are perceived in South Korea. They are viewed almost like mystics who can harness the Earth's energies and powers to communicate with the other world. Essentially, people believe a shaman can establish contact with that realm to provide assistance, and there is a conviction that seeking a shaman's help could potentially transform one's destiny, to change the lines of their destiny and bring something good into their lives. A shaman performs rituals and prayers for the client. He performs dances, commissions special music, and conducts sacred fire ceremonies, havans. You know, the sort of thing involving shamanistic rituals and exorcisms. Exactly that kind of practice exists in Korea too. And here, we have Shim, Lee's aunt, who had been practicing this kind of shamanism for a very long time, nearly 40 years. And she wasn't just practicing it, she had actually established an entire cult, or rather, a group of her own. This leader, who had a large following, was a well-known tantric in her area, which allowed her to keep her entire family under her control. No one in the family could even take a breath without her permission. She wielded immense power over them all. Now, the issue of power aside, the real problem was that she was the family's chief instigator. She had a real knack for spreading gossip and inciting people against one another. In fact, Shim's grandfather had passed away nearly 40 years ago. Ever since his death, Shim began to feel that his spirit had entered her body. She even built a small shrine and declared to the world that she was fully imbued with her grandfather's powers and now wished to work for everyone's well-being. "If you face any problem, come to me. Discuss it with me. I will resolve whatever issue you are dealing with." But people started calling her a fool. Yet, Shim was incredibly patient. She waited and remained steadfast. You know, if a lie is told to you so often that you get used to hearing it, you might eventually start believing it to be true, and people tend to accept such lies as truth very quickly. Shim would repeatedly tell people, "I am the only one who can make God listen to you. I am the only one who can atone for all the sins you committed in your past lives." People began to believe her words, and believe me, this method of hers was incredibly effective. No matter who came to her with their problems, she had just one approach, a single method that worked every time: the concept of the past life. Yes, whenever someone approached her with an issue, instead of connecting them with a deity or offering a practical solution, she would begin by recounting the mistakes of their past life, telling them who they were, where they were born, and pointing out the specific errors or sins they had committed back then. And that is precisely why you are having to face all these troubles in this lifetime. Yes, if someone lost their job, they would go to her. She would simply say, "You committed this sin in your past life. That is why you lost your job. You got divorced. You must have committed some misdeed in a past life. That is why the divorce happened and why you fell ill. You are settling the karmic accounts of your past lives in this one." And whenever something went wrong in someone's future, she would personally go to that person and stage a drama, saying, "Look, I had already told you that the karmic accounts from your past lives were bound to be settled in this lifetime. And if you don't want any further major disasters in your life, you'll have to undergo that cleansing ritual. You'll need to have your sins washed away. You'll have to atone for it and take remedial measures." Well, obviously, desperate times call for desperate measures. Problems arise in everyone's life. So, if we find that kind of support, we end up placing immense faith in it. That's the extent of our understanding. That's as far as our thinking goes. So, the people there began to rely heavily on Shim. They trusted her because she had predicted that something bad might happen, and indeed, terrible things were happening to them. She would then compel them, insisting that they undergo a specific ritual or remedy. And this wasn't just any ordinary remedy, like performing a haven or making a modest donation. Instead, she offered a complete, foolproof package. Simply pay the fee, and you wouldn't even need to be present. She handled everything herself, offering prayers, dedicating her time, and procuring all the necessary materials. "I'll handle everything. You don't need to do a thing. Just give me the money, and I'll take care of the rest myself." People began to think, "All right, this works. It saves us time, and we won't have to run around anywhere." They believed she would manage the arrangements, so they started paying her huge sums of money. Furthermore, she would tell every client, "Look, whatever ritual you want performed, you have to get it done only through me." If you were to go to some other shaman or tantric practitioner, they might end up making your life even worse, bringing even more complications into it. Naturally, people get scared, and many did. There are tantrics who stage elaborate spectacles, dragging people off to remote mountains to perform their rituals and incantations. But she used to have these rituals performed right from the comfort of home. Shim himself had 4 children, but he kept them completely cut off from the outside world, totally isolated, 100% cut off. The 4 of them lived strictly inside the house. They never got a chance to go out, not even an opportunity to step outside the house, no permission whatsoever. They were not allowed to speak to anyone from the outside. She wouldn't really converse with anyone. People simply knew that Shim had 4 children. Yet, Shim herself was extremely talkative. She would greet everyone with a smile and chat away. She was the sort of woman who would charm you with sweet words while secretly undermining you. Yet everyone placed immense trust in her. Anyone coming to hand over money would visit her home, as she had set up a temple right there. Naturally, upon entering the house, they would see her 4 children wandering about. But none of the children ever actually interacted with any client. They were merely visible from a distance, just 4 kids wandering around the house. That was the sort of controlling nature Shim had. You can well imagine what was bound to happen next. As time went on, Shim's children began to grow up. Now, Shim was obviously a greedy woman. She valued other people's money above all else. So, she told her children to take up jobs, specifically work they could do from home. Eventually, all 4 children got the opportunity to work remotely, and they held excellent jobs, all while working from home. However, Shim would take their salaries into her own hands. As soon as their pay was credited, she would immediately withdraw the money from their bank accounts. She started spending on an extravagant lifestyle. Just imagine, a woman who is well past middle age, if she steps out with a vast amount of money, effectively the combined salaries of 4 grown children. Her lifestyle will obviously be very lavish. She will wear fine clothes, enjoy excellent food and drink, and naturally move in the company of high-profile people. As she began mingling with prominent figures, they started believing that she represented a substantial firm, a fiat, and reliable party. Capitalizing on this perception, she began borrowing money from everyone she associated with. In fact, she didn't even spare her close friends. She would borrow money from anyone who spoke to her. Naturally, those people would eventually ask for their money back. If they had lent her money, they would naturally ask for it back. But instead of repaying them, she would tell all her creditors, "Until now, you are simply people I owed money to. Now, become my lenders. Start charging interest on the money you gave me. I will pay you back with interest." Naturally, upon hearing this, they would be tempted and think, "Well, all right then." The mindset was, we will eventually get our principal back anyway, so why not just sit back and live off the interest for free? He had borrowed lakhs of rupees from people in the neighborhood. In fact, over time, the amount had ballooned into crores. He had borrowed crores from those around him, and the interest on that debt kept mounting. However, the combined salaries of all 4 children were no longer sufficient to maintain their extremely lavish lifestyle. That is why Shim set her sights on her sister, Lee's mother, and the entire family. After all, Lee was running a very successful restaurant. She was managing the business, and it was clearly generating substantial earnings. Now, as I mentioned, Shim possessed an extraordinary amount of patience. She was willing to wait as long as necessary to get things done. She took advantage of this situation. She would repeatedly call her younger sister, Lee's mother, and keep saying, "Something doesn't feel right in your family." For nearly 3 years, Shim kept telling her sister that things didn't seem right and that something bad could happen. Now, obviously, if a woman hears for 3 years that something doesn't seem right in the family, that something could go wrong, then naturally, a fear will take root in her mind. What exactly could happen? After 3 years of conversation, the person finally said, "I feel that your daughter is possessed by evil spirits, and in the future, she will be the one to destroy your entire family. She will be the cause of your ruin." Upon hearing this, the mother was terrified, absolutely petrified, and turned to her elder sister for a solution. Being a cunning woman, the sister replied, "Look, there is a remedy for this. And we had to do this. We had to cleanse Lee by any means necessary, specifically by performing this ritual." She started asking her own younger sister for money under the pretext of this ritual, claiming she needed to perform ceremonies for Lee right from her own home. She said she would buy the necessary supplies and asked for funds. Without even consulting Lee, Lee's mother began sending large sums of money to her elder sister, and this process began to repeat. Ritual after ritual, remedy after remedy, yajna after yajna, havan after havan. Yet, even after performing so many havans, she remained unsatisfied. She kept insisting that she was not yet cleansed, and that there was still a great deal more work to be done for her purification. Deep down, Shim knew that the only thing he wanted was Lee's restaurant. He didn't care about the money itself. Sure, the money was coming in. That was fine, a good thing. It covered his expenses, but his sights were set on the restaurant, because that was the main source of wealth, the goose that laid the golden eggs. He wanted the restaurant, the very source of the family's income, for himself. But before that, he wondered, why shouldn't I open a similar restaurant in Jeju City? And the remarkable thing was that the entire amount of money required to open the restaurant in Jeju City, he demanded more and more money from the Lee family under the guise of performing rituals, specifically around 18 million won, the local currency. The Lee family handed over this sum, 18 million won, to Shim so that he could cleanse Lee. However, Instead of using the money for the intended purpose, he used it to open a fine restaurant in Jeju City. But where intentions are dishonest, there can be no true prosperity, and that is exactly what happened here. Since Shim had no real plan, the restaurant simply didn't work out. It was a total flop, and the entire 18 million won investment was completely wiped out, a massive financial loss. On top of that 18 million won, Shim took on even heavier debt from various sources in a desperate attempt to keep the restaurant running. He already had connections with people who were willing to lend him money. He tried to keep the business afloat using these additional substantial loans, but everything ultimately went to waste in the ensuing losses. But by now, the debt had become overwhelming. She owed a massive amount of money to people. By the time the COVID-19 pandemic ended, Shim had accumulated a debt of approximately 9 crore. Amidst this stress, Shim couldn't focus on her work properly. She was constantly receiving calls from creditors rather than clients. Everyone she owed money to would call her, while new clients were virtually non-existent. She had to pay back 9 crore, and on top of that, the interest kept mounting. How would she manage it all? To pay off old debts, she started taking on new ones, but ultimately, the burden was bound to crush her. She had become so frustrated that she couldn't think of any other way out. She had set her mind on running a restaurant like Lee's in Jeju City, which was the reason she had incurred such massive debt, but when the restaurant failed, the money was lost. She realized that the entire idea had stemmed from Lee, so she thought, why not just run that very business? Since she didn't have a restaurant of her own, why not make Lee's restaurant hers? And Shim knew exactly how she could go about making Lee's restaurant her own. One day in March 2022, Shim called her younger sister and said, I had a terrible nightmare last night in which I felt that a massive crisis was about to befall your family. I've also found a solution to this crisis. You need to take your entire family to Ullingdo Island, which is located near South Korea. Ullingdo Island, pack up all your belongings and move there immediately. For years, Lee's mother had been listening to her older sister. By this point, she had already been heavily manipulated. So, Lee's mother had to accept the idea, agreeing that since something like this was bound to happen, she really ought to move away. The problem, however, was that although she was running the restaurant, the title was in the name of Lee's parents. At this point, Shim told Lee's mother, you are going to Ulongdag Island, so transfer the restaurant to Lee's name. Let her keep it. Let her stay here. But you people need to get out of here. Leave immediately. Lee's mother was terrified by this. She discussed the matter with her husband, explaining what her older sister had said and insisting that they had to leave. Let's leave Lee's story there for a moment. Her husband didn't have much expertise in the matter either. He too was swayed by what they were saying. They packed up all their belongings. Ultimately, the entire process, including purchasing a new home in Ogangdong and managing the move, took well over a year and a half. Finally, having packed everything up and transferred the restaurant into Lee's name, they bought a new house in Ogangdong and moved there. Lee now realized that the restaurant was in her name. However, Shim reassured Lee's family, her parents, telling them not to worry about her at all. I will stay with Lee and look after her here. Lee is the owner, after all, so there's no issue. I'll be here acting as her manager. Having an older person around will keep her in check, so she won't go astray or wander off course. And for this very reason, in January 2024, when everyone was relocating to Ullingdo Island, Lee was forced to temporarily close the restaurant he had been running for so many years. A long queue had formed outside. No one knew where Lee and his entire family had gone. None of their phones were reachable either. But after remaining closed for nearly 2 weeks, Lee finally returned to the restaurant. She came back after relocating her entire family to Ogangdong Island. When she opened the restaurant and people saw her inside, they felt a great sense of relief. Everyone had been deeply worried about her, as she was beloved by all. She would cheerfully attend to everyone's needs and converse with them all in a friendly manner. She also delighted everyone by cooking and serving delicious dishes. Seeing Lee brought a sense of relief to everyone, yet they felt extremely uncomfortable because Lee's aunt Shim was sitting in the manager's chair, staring intently at them all. Now, whenever someone came to Shim to settle their bill, she would start asking the customers very peculiar questions, asking what was going on in their lives. She would claim, "I can see your future, I can see your past life," yet people had come there to eat meat, to unwind and relieve their stress, and to enjoy a peaceful meal. But even there, she was riling people up, which struck them as odd. They went and told Lee about the things she was saying. Lee then explained to them, "That's just how my aunt is. Don't take it to heart. Just settle your bill and you're free to leave. It's no problem." Shim had been working there for only a month when he pointed out to Lee that a significant amount of money had accumulated in her bank account. "From now on, you will have to deposit all the money earned, everything this entire restaurant generates, into my bank account." Lee was quite young, just 30 years old, and her aunt was 79. She couldn't bring herself to refuse, figuring that since he was the one saying it, he must have had a good reason. Lee, too, began depositing all that money into Shim's account. Now, where was all this money actually going? Yes, you guessed it right. The funds were going straight from Shim's account to pay the interest, and only the interest, on the loans he had taken from various creditors. He had borrowed a total of around 9 crore from people. Lee was forced to work up to 18 hours a day at his own restaurant. She would open the restaurant around 8 a.m. and it would be 11 or 12 o'clock at night by the time she closed it up. Yet, Lee was happy simply because she was running her own restaurant. She believed that sooner or later, the problems facing her life and the troubles befalling her family would be resolved and everyone would return. It was all going to be fine. Her aunt was also there to look after things. But Lee had no idea that by appointing her aunt as the manager, she had not brought in a manager at all. Instead, she had invited her own doom. By September 2024, Lee had become incredibly frustrated. All the earnings were going into her aunt Shim's personal account rather than being reinvested in the restaurant, and Shim wasn't spending a single rupee on the business itself. Now, obviously, supplies and raw materials are brought into the restaurant, and there are various other expenses, including staff salaries. But Shim flatly refused. He insisted that I would have to cover all the costs myself, while all the earnings would go directly to him. But by September 2024, Lee had become extremely frustrated. Because of all this, she decided she would no longer send a single penny to her aunt's account. And the moment she stopped sending money and started investing in her restaurant, buying supplies and the like, Shim felt very bad about it. He could see that Lee wasn't sending him any money, so he confronted her, asking why she had stopped sending the funds. Lee replied, "This entire restaurant belongs to me. I built it, and I will handle all the financial management myself. If you just want to sit here like a manager, feel free to do so. That's fine, but I will be the one handling all the money." As soon as Shim heard this, she was dealt a massive blow, as it seemed her money-making machine was suddenly falling apart. So she issued a final ultimatum to Lee: either hand over all the money, just as she had been doing, or pack her bags and go live with her mother on Olongdong Island. "I'll manage this restaurant on my own. I don't need you here at all." As soon as Lee heard this, she realized she was about to lose the restaurant. However, she was finally gaining her freedom. So she chose freedom and said, "Fine, I'll pack my bags and leave. I'll go and start my life over somewhere else on my own." But the moment Shim heard this, he was shocked. After all, his golden goose was leaving. So, September 18th, 2024, was set to be the final day, the day Lee was finally going to leave the restaurant and walk away from years of hard work. But before she left, Shim asked her to sit down for a moment, saying, "I need to talk to you. There's no rush to leave before nightfall." However, in the meantime, Shim called his 3 sons and asked them to come to the restaurant. He also called a staunch follower, someone who used to accompany him during all his rituals, asking him to come over because he needed his help. By afternoon, all 4 of them had arrived at the restaurant, and Shim explained to the group that Lee had become possessed to an extreme degree. He told them that a malevolent spirit, a truly evil force, had taken over her, and they had to save her from it by any means necessary. This power had to be extracted from Lee's body. Having been under Shim's control for so many years, these 4 individuals did not question Lee's actions at all. They didn't even ask why she was doing this. As soon as Shim announced that they had to carry out this task and explained the plan, they followed his instructions and headed into the market. From there, I went to a welding shop, a place where metalwork is done, and had a large table-like frame constructed. Just try to imagine it, a massive table, really quite large, with numerous metal angles welded across the center, much like the grill used for barbecues or for cooking dishes like sharp. They had a table made exactly like that one, brought it straight to the restaurant, and took it up to the 2nd floor. Then they waited for Lee to arrive. A short while later, she showed up at the restaurant with all her bags. As soon as she arrived, the 4 of them went up to her, grabbed her hands, and, without saying a word or asking anything, dragged her straight up to the 2nd floor. Shim, who had locked the restaurant from the inside, also went up to the 2nd floor, where an exorcism was about to be performed. This exorcism is truly harrowing. The story is about to become extremely brutal from this point on. I will be discussing graphic details, so if you cannot handle such content, please stop watching this video right here. I think you've understood the situation. If you can handle it, then come along with me. The 4 of them grabbed Lee and took him up to the 2nd floor. Shim followed them up and ordered the 4 men to tie Lee onto the table frame, the one they had brought in. Just imagine it. There was this large table-like frame, fitted with metal angle bars, and Lee was forced to lie face down on it. Her arms and legs were pulled back and strapped to that metal frame using thick chains. She was bound so tightly that any attempt to move even slightly would obviously have caused injury to poor Lee herself. Marks would appear right on her skin. She had been bound so tightly. Now Shim had placed a chair and seated herself right in front, and she ordered someone to fetch that large metal basin, the one in which she had already placed some coals. Lee was watching all of this unfold right before her eyes. 2 men went and brought back the basin, which was already filled with a large quantity of coals. As soon as he arrived, Shim poured oil into the coal-filled metal pan and set it ablaze. Once the coals began to glow intensely, Shim carefully placed the pan beneath the table frame. The heat radiating upwards was felt directly around the abdomen of poor Lee, who was lying strapped on top. Lee clearly understood what was about to happen to her. Yet, memories must have been flooding her mind. After all, she had spent years preparing dishes in this very restaurant. She had roasted meat on a barbecue grill countless times. She had cooked meat over the fire again and again. But now, she was the one tied to such a grill, with a massive glowing basin of burning coals beneath her. Intense heat was radiating from within, and she could feel it inside his stomach. His stomach was burning as the heat intensified. Since all the coals had gradually begun to glow, an immense amount of heat was being emitted, radiating directly onto Lee's body. Naturally, no one could withstand such extreme heat or endure such high temperatures. Lee began to thrash about. She repeatedly tried to scream, but Shim forced her mouth open and stuffed a large piece of cloth into it to silence her and prevent her cries from being heard outside. Gradually, the top Lee was wearing burned away and fused to her stomach. The fabric had melted right into her skin. Just imagine the excruciating pain Lee must have been enduring at that moment. The coals kept glowing intensely like that for nearly 45 minutes, but Shim still wasn't satisfied because Lee was still alive. So she told one of the men who had accompanied her to fetch more coals. He ran downstairs to get them. He filled a sack with plenty of coal and brought it up. After emptying the fresh coal into the metal pan, Shim specifically pulled the pan forward, positioning it so that the direct heat would strike poor Lee right in the face. Once the pan was lowered into place, poor Lee couldn't even move away. She kept frantically jerking her face about. He filled a sack with plenty of coal and brought it up. After emptying the fresh coal into the metal pan, Shim specifically pulled the pan forward, positioning it so that the direct heat would strike poor Lee right in the face. Once the pan was lowered into place, poor Lee couldn't even move away. She kept frantically jerking her face about. Just imagine what Lee must have been feeling at that moment. As soon as he shifted back, the direct heat hit not only his legs, but also his stomach, an area that had already suffered burns. Then, the skin on his stomach, exposed to that heat, slowly began to melt. Her internal organs were heating up intensely. Would you believe the heat was so extreme that all her organs actually ruptured inside poor Lee's body? As they ruptured, the blood circulating within her body began to boil. That boiling blood was coursing through her entire system, but the torment didn't end there. After roasting her entire body, they finally placed that basin full of hot charcoal right beneath Lee's face. Now, the blazing fire was moving towards her face again. By the time the pan arrived this time, the skin had already boiled from within. It was completely scorched. She had sustained 4th-degree burns. At this point, poor Lee had lost consciousness. She could no longer feel a thing, yet she was still alive. But the moment Shim saw that Lee had lost consciousness, he first untied her hands and feet and just tried to imagine the scene. He picked up the remaining embers from the pan one by one and placed them on Lee's body to make it look like a natural accident. In fact, he even brought some raw meat and placed it on the poor woman's burning body to further reinforce the impression of a natural accident. After spending a full hour on these preparations, the fire in the pan was finally lit at 3:45 p.m. and at 6:49 p.m. the fire finally died down. For more than 3 hours, that vat had kept burning right beneath poor Lee. You can imagine how a living person was roasted alive by this man. Only then did he call the paramedics to report that an accident had occurred. When the police arrived at the scene along with the paramedics, he told them that Lee was an excellent chef at their restaurant. She was cooking for customers when the accident occurred, and she ended up being roasted on the grill. Paramedics administered first aid and immediately rushed Lee to the hospital. However, upon examination, doctors discovered that all her internal organs had been burned and had ruptured. She had already suffered multiple organ failure. The next day, poor Lee breathed her last in the hospital. She had effectively already died internally. But by the next day, he had finally breathed his last. The police recorded statements from 5 people: Shim, his 3 children, and the man who had accompanied them. All 5 stated that Lee had been extremely careless and unfocused on his work, which led to the mistake. Initially, the police thought this was plausible, but suddenly, during the investigation, they noticed that CCTV cameras were installed on the 2nd floor. And when the police checked the CCTV recordings, everything became clear to them. Upon viewing the 3 hours of footage, they understood how a metal frame had been constructed and brought to the location, and how Lee had been forcibly dragged up and restrained. The entire 3-hour ordeal of torture had been captured in full HD on the CCTV. Finally, on May 22, 2025, these 5 individuals were arrested and charged with 2nd-degree murder. However, the police had already grasped the full picture during the investigation. understanding how Shim had controlled the entire family for a long time, blackmailed them, and extorted money from them. It also emerged that Shim was burdened with a debt of 1.8 billion won, and she had been siphoning off money from this restaurant to pay it off to her creditors. Some of Lee's friends came forward and testified in court that she was deeply distressed by her aunt but felt trapped. This was because her family had always conditioned her to believe that her aunt, the 79-year-old Shim, was an incredibly powerful shaman, and everyone is compelled to do whatever she says. They have no choice but to comply. However, none of this holds any validity in court. Matters reached an extreme when Shim stood inside the courtroom and declared, "I believed that Lee had become possessed by a truly evil spirit, and I was compelled to perform an exorcism on her so that whatever power had entered Lee's body could be driven out." But the most heart-wrenching moment of the entire case for me was when Lee's parents were brought into the courtroom to give their statements. Yet, instead of pushing to have Lee's death ruled a murder, her parents told the judge, "Please, regarding everything that has happened, we request leniency for Lee's aunt, Shim, who is 79 years old, and the 4 young men involved, because we believe our daughter Lee was possessed from childhood. She was inhabited by evil forces. That is why we were compelled to leave our daughter with her aunt, so she could stay there and be free of that evil force." You can well imagine the kind of manipulation that was going on. The entire family was so swayed by Shim that Lee's parents failed to see that their daughter had been murdered, yet they continued to side with Shim. Eventually, by September 2025, the court finally announced the sentence: life imprisonment for Shim. But how much of her life is actually left? She is already 80 years old. How much longer can she possibly live? As for the other 4 individuals involved, they were sentenced to 20 to 25 years in prison, a sentence that is non-bailable, meaning they cannot be released on bail. But the truly heartbreaking part is that a passionate young woman who is striving to set up her own business will now never be able to run it. Her customers will never see Lee's smile again, and Lee will never again be able to cook anything in her kitchen. No dish can be prepared. See you in the next one. Thanks for watching.